Good morning. Trying to figure out if this had a laser pointer on it or not. It does not. All right. This morning I want to talk about needs. Um, Now this mysterious pyramid we'll get to in a second, but before we move to the next slide, I just want to pose a couple of questions, a couple of rhetorical questions. But please answer them in your own head if you want to. But when it comes to needs, what kind of needs do you have? And how do we differentiate between what needs are more important than others and which needs we need to prioritize over others? Okay, so to reveal the mysterious pyramid there, if you've ever taken a psychology class, then you may have seen or heard of this before. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at least for me in psychology class, there was a giant poster with this similar kind of graphic on it. I always remember that it was very colorful and it was a huge poster, so it always drew your attention to it. And if you haven't taken a psychology class or you haven't heard of this before, I assure you that it is not a difficult concept to grasp, and we're going to talk about it very briefly um, for the first portion of the lesson. So, we'll begin at the bottom of the pyramid, the widest part of the pyramid, and that's, as you'll soon see, basically the core structure for how this system or how this model works. And again, this is just a model. This is a theoretical kind of conceptualization of someone's ideas about how needs should be structured and how they should be handled. This is obviously not true. This is not, 100% fact or anything that's been empirically proven or anything like that. But beginning at the base of the pyramid, our physiological needs, and these are things that we take for granted every day, things that we just assume will be available as soon as we wake up. At least for us here in the United States, we're very blessed with these things. So, as simple as air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat, shelter, whether it's your home or whether it's a homeless shelter or whether it's just a canopy under a tree. These are some of the most basic things that we need to just survive and progress to the next day. The next step up from that are safety needs, and this kind of goes beyond just having a place to live and it goes to having a safe place to live. So, having personal security, so whether you have a means to defend yourself or um, whether you have a code of laws or police officers, some sort of law enforcement to help keep you safe. And then it also goes to employment, resources, health, and property. So this is like having, obviously, being able to have a job, having accessible medical care, and being able to have any sort of wounds or illnesses treated. And the thought is, as you might kind of realize with some of these things, that these are supposed to, at least in the theoretical model, they're supposed to describe the needs for any human, regardless of whether they're living in modern day or if they're living in prehistoric times or caveman, if you want to think about that. Um, the thought is that you need to address the kind of most basic concerns, and the society of humanity has evolved to kind of incorporate these needs into it. And so far, all of these things seem pretty basic. Yeah, to survive, you need to be safe, you need to have a place to live, you need things to eat, things to drink. But then as we move to love and belonging, this is where we start to see some things that, unfortunately, some people that we may even know might not have these things. So this section includes friendship, intimacy, family, and having a sense of connection. So these are things that are still quite essential as we're only 3 steps up on the pyramid so far, but these are not exactly things that you can hold in your hand. These are not things that you can really have a concrete grasp over necessarily. And as we move even higher, then we get to esteem, and this starts to go into kind of the psychological realm of what do we think of ourselves? How do others think of us? Do we have status, recognition? Do we have the respect of others? And can we appreciate our own worth and feel confident in our own abilities? And also, do we have um, a community to be a part of? And moreover, do we have some sort of distinction or status within those communities? And then freedom is the last one there. And, of course, freedom, you can think about freedom on what kind of scale. Are you free to act as you will? Are you free to go wherever you want to or to do whatever you want to? And that's something that we're definitely going to talk about in more detail later on in the lesson. And then the final kind of fifth, very top of the pyramid is self-actualization, which is essentially having dreams or goals, having aspirations to chase after, and having additionally what's necessary to actually work towards and achieve those goals. So, this graphic used the words desire to become the most that one can be, but I would say that kind of more broadly, this is just, you've got all those other things taken care of. Now you want to chase your dreams and things that you have always wanted to do. So I know a lot of words, but kind of the long story short here is that of this original five-stage model, which I believe was published in 1943, um, the first four levels are oftentimes referred to as deficiency needs, and the top level of self-actualization is known as a growth or a being need. And the concept behind all of it, as I kind of alluded to earlier, was that individuals have to satisfy the lower level deficit needs before they can progress to the higher level growth needs. So I enjoy playing board games and video games, and this kind of concept of you need to complete this before you can move on to the next is something that's at least very intuitive to me because a lot of games work that way where there's rules and obviously nobody's going to hand you a card in life and say, great, you finished the safety needs category. Feel free to move on to love and belonging. But the concept behind this theory is that naturally, you will strive to fulfill those lower needs before your mind begins to think about those higher level needs. And that fourth bullet point there kind of describes that each person has this innate desire to move up the hierarchy towards a higher level of self-actualization. And it also notes that unfortunately, there can be things that happen in life that cause somebody to fluctuate, usually, fall kind of further down between the different levels of the pyramid. And so therefore nobody moves, not everybody will move through the pyramid in a straight line and never, find themselves going back and forth. And I think that that's pretty accurate. I think that it's true that um, there can be things that happen where you lose your sense of love and belonging. And, blessedly in the United States of America, we're not really oftentimes finding ourselves losing access to shelter or losing access to clean water or air to breathe. Um, but that nevertheless does make sense when you think about some kind of what we call third world countries, places that don't always have those things to be taken for granted. And so Maslow came up with a expanded hierarchy in 1970 that added more levels than just the five. And we're just really briefly going to go over some of those expanded levels. So um, the first four should look very familiar, but kind of self-actualization was expanded into four different growth needs. I guess it was kind of imbalanced before that there were four deficiency needs and only one growth need before. But think that this came about because growth needs, they don't stem from a lack of something, but rather they come from a desire to grow as a person. And the thought behind it is that um, once you've gotten to a point where you can exercise that kind of more intellectual and creative behavior, that those things become more available to you as a person. And a kind of another critical context to this theory is that it relies on the fact that every person is capable of and has the desire to move up the hierarchy towards self-actualization, and that that's within your set of capabilities, pending that you've fulfilled the lower parts of the pyramid. And so that's something that you may have thoughts on whether that's true or not. But getting into this expanded hierarchy, we'll start again from the kind of bottom of the newer needs that were added. So cognitive needs are the knowledge and understanding, being able to satisfy your curiosity about the way that things work. Aesthetic needs are kind of an appreciation for art form, beauty, and balance in different forms. So this can be art, music, appreciating nature, or other kind of similar pursuits. And then um, self-actualization needs kind of remain the same, so I'm not going to rehash those, but this very kind of tippity top of transcendence was added. And this, as Christians, will sound familiar to you. This talks about um, the human desire to connect with a higher purpose or understanding the universe better. It emphasizes altruism, spiritual connection, and helping others achieve their potential. And um, right, we're seeking deep unity and understanding and belonging with one another in this level. So basically, this is the most secular way to describe religion, or in particular, I think the most secular way to describe Christianity without actually using words like God or Jesus. And, um, I think we're going to get to kind of evaluation of this model, but before we do that, I wanted to take a moment and just appreciate the fact of how many of those things that we just put over on the slides, how many of those needs that us here in this room can say with confidence that we have those things. And kind of the first major pillar, besides just going over Maslow's hierarchy of needs of this lesson, is praise and the power of prayer. And that's something that I, at least, oftentimes need to remind myself of. Um, is that as we read in Philippians chapter 4, in verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And in verse 7, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so we're instructed to, in every situation and with thanksgiving, to pray. And furthermore, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And as a new Christian, I remember being kind of confused, and I had, at that point in college, I had studied a lot of kind of older Catholicism, more medieval Catholicism, and monasticism, and that kind of uh, lifestyle was more prevalent back then. And I always thought, pray continually. Like, well, I guess that's what the monks did, and a lot of the priests, that they dedicated themselves to praying continuously. And um, it wasn't until kind of further study, and this is something that we've even talked about, I believe, in our Bible studies here. But this is more the thought that if anything should ever come up, you don't need to necessarily fold your hands and bow your head and there, that's a prayer. But rather, if anything happens to you and you have a moment where you want to thank God, or when you are in fear of something and you want to say a prayer, that you can just in your head just immediately start praying, and it doesn't take any sort of prerequisite or anything like that. And that is how you achieve praying continually, is always having that impulse to go to prayer whenever there's anything that you need to share with God. And then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 again in verse 11 this time, therefore encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. And this takes me to that love and belonging category, where we have a sense of community and we're instructed to encourage one another and build each other up, and how thankful we should be that we have that built into our faith, and that we have that built into our community here, not only here at Ellicott City, but the friendship that we share with other Christians, either in this area or across the country or even across the world. We have those relationships and we have that network to fall back onto. And then in terms of self-esteem, as is commonly quoted, John chapter 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And so, no matter how hard your life has been, learning the truth that God has given up and sacrificed his only Son for you, despite all the bad things that you may think that you've done, that immediately gives you value and gives you that kind of status and recognition that you were looking for. It doesn't come from other humans or other parts of society, but it comes from God, and it comes from the Most Almighty, that you have value and that you have something to be proud of. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sent his son to die for you. And then in talking about freedom, which I mentioned that we were going to come back to the word freedom, in John chapter 8, verse 31 to 32, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And so, even with the abolishment of slavery, and in the United States, that each person is their own person and is not under the ownership or direct control or license of another person, that we can still have slavery and we can still be enslaved by our sin in a spiritual sense, that we do not have freedom that has been given to us through Jesus Christ by God, that sets us free truly unless we have obeyed his will and we have accepted his grace. And that is something that I think really, to me, defines that freedom category. Because as I mentioned, that word freedom is very vague and it's hard to tell exactly what Maslow had intended without perhaps asking him directly. And so I just want to take a second and, short of leading a prayer from up here, I just encourage us all to, tonight, when you say your nightly prayer, just encourage you to thank God and pray to God for the fact that we can claim so many of these needs as being fulfilled because of the love that He's shown us. And for me, at least, that's something that I've been trying to focus on a lot in my prayer life is um, taking the time to appreciate every single thing that's been given, even if it's something as basic as clean air and clean water. So, moving on to talking a little bit more about our needs and talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and whether it's good or not, I have to kind of go off of the slides for a second and just say that when I initially started um, designing this lesson and thinking up ideas about this lesson, my intention was to kind of rip apart Maslow's hierarchy of needs and say that it was no good and say that we have a much better model to follow as presented in the Bible. But I actually had to kind of revise and go under a major kind of second version of this lesson because even though in some ways that's true, I would say that in general, this is a pretty good way to organize the needs that we have as humans. Of course, this is coming from the standpoint of survival and prosperity here in the world, but I do think that it is useful to have a way to kind of categorize these needs. And we're going to go over in more detail why I think there's value to that and why I would just kind of suggest as Christians that we are wise to a different ordering or perhaps a different kind of um, polish on that model. So my first kind of point is um, this hierarchy of needs comes from the standpoint of how do I survive and progress to the next day, and how do I achieve the most success that I can here on Earth? My question would be, shouldn't we be prioritizing eternity? Um, whether or not you believe in an eternity and whether or not you believe in life after death, if we kind of suspend one's thoughts on that question, wouldn't everybody agree that eternity is a much greater stretch of time than our time here on Earth? And if you could, wouldn't you rather secure a better future in that eternity than the temporary time that we have here on Earth? And so I think of Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, which I don't have up here on the slides, but I'll read them to you. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And so why would this be? So in James chapter 4, verse 14, why you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. So even though we can feel like we've had long lives or that the days drag on, compared to eternity, our life on earth is just a mist. It's just a temporary flash compared to the broad spectrum of eternity. And then in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, we read how our citizenship is in heaven. And that's something that Craig mentioned a couple of weeks ago in his lesson, that um, our citizenship, where we belong and where we should be focused on, is in heaven, not on earth. So that's kind of my first major flaw that I would point out with the hierarchy of needs is that the focus here says that these things, spiritual, these things that relate to our faith and our Christianity would be the final step, only something to be reached once you've secured everything else. And it's viewed more as a kind of personal thought experiment or fulfillment, like, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go help people. That's kind of my final step of how I can feel fulfilled here on earth, rather than being kind of a more critical survival thing. So, as kind of a, um, I guess, a blooper or a, kind of an afterthought, that was what I was going to originally say, was that I was going to propose that the pyramid should be flipped on its head. But I had issue with presenting that because it is true that in order to worship and in order to adequately be able to do that, we have to be alive at least long enough to hear the word and kind of do man's part as we read in um, the kind of closing slide graphic that we have. And so, you know, moving on though, there's still issues that I have with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I believe that they'll take us through a useful line of thought when it comes to the scriptures. So, is it really true that everyone has capability to move up the first few deficiency steps of the pyramid? Um, it's easy to think of us in the United States of America as having those things already taken for granted, but when we read in the Bible about Jesus and his ministry and the people that he worked with some of the most forgotten and passed over people in society. And that's something that I take issue with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is that it was clearly created by somebody who has the privilege of living in a first world country where those things are easily attainable. But if you go into the most remote areas of South America, Africa, even some of the poorest areas in America, those things aren't always taken for granted. And so I think it's a little bit of an impasse to say that um, everybody has the capability to move up those things. And God has promised us something that is available to everybody. And He's promised us in the hope of eternal life that no matter what level you're in or no matter what kind of background you come from, that is available to you. And I have in the bottom right there a screenshot from an earlier lesson that I gave about identity that was based off of one of Eric Borlaug's lessons that he didn't have a chance to present to us. And that's something that I wanted to kind of remind ourselves of, is that if you're looking for an identity or looking in um, the scriptures for the way that God has assigned us value and has told us that we are valuable. Those verses all come from Ephesians. So Ephesians chapter 1, verse 1, or Ephesians chapter 2, verse 21. Um, if you just go a couple of chapters into Ephesians, you can read all about how God has provided those things for us. And I'm going to have this slide in greater resolution on the next part here. But I wanted to talk about and rehash again that if we're talking about survival and talking about the most important survival, even if we pass from this earth, we have another tier of survival when it comes to whether or not we're dead in our sin. And so I would argue that if you want to talk about physical survival here on earth, that we also need to talk about our spiritual survival. Okay, so here, as promised, are those verses from Ephesians. And if you want to review those, you're more than welcome to. But this is just kind of me backing up my point that if John chapter 3, verse 16 doesn't illustrate to you well enough that you have value, that these are verses that you can go to show you that that self-esteem and that promise has been given to us very clearly in the scriptures. So what needs do you have? This is the Chichen Itza, and it is a different kind of pyramid than what we showed before. This one has very clear steps. And I want you to think seriously for a second. Do you ever feel incomplete? Do you ever feel like something is missing? Or that there's something that you're lacking, something that you still need? And can you pinpoint where in those categories that might be? Again, that's where I have a hard time saying that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is complete garbage. It's because it is useful to point to something and say, yes, I'm lacking in the love and belonging need. I don't feel like I have a sense of community. Which category does that fall under? So when you think about times where you're feeling at your most down and where you're feeling like something's missing, what category do those needs fall in? And um, I would say that those feelings are normal. As we read, it's common for people to go back and forth and fluctuate between those levels because life is hard and things happen to us and they make us kind of go back and forth between those categories, don't they? And as we've kind of taken a little bit of time to give thanks to God for what He's made available to us, are we realizing that perhaps we haven't taken the necessary steps that we need to accept those gifts? So, as we had those verses from Ephesians up on the slide, if you're reading those things and realizing that there's a lot left on the table that you haven't claimed yet, if you haven't yet claimed that identity that has been given to us through Christ, then we need to look to a kind of pyramid like this that has clear steps. And of course, I had to roll in this slide that I had talked about earlier, that these here are steps of salvation. And um, I want to kind of break down. I know oftentimes this slide gets reached at the end where time is short and people feel the pressure of um, wrapping up so people can go to lunch. But I purposefully wanted to leave more time today to actually give this slide a little bit more time because there's a lot of information baked into this slide. So, um, when we talk about our needs, so it might be that you don't fully understand or feel like you've spent enough time talking about, okay, well, how is it that God has given us these gifts, and how is it that Christ, through his sacrifice, saved us? And so that's going to be the first three steps there, God's part. And that's something that we all continually need to study. This is something that, no matter how long you've been a Christian, that we need to remind ourselves of these things regularly. But if you're in the audience today and you feel like, yeah, man's part, I get that's my part that I have to do, but I just don't feel like I understand yet even the most basic part. That's again another part where I think Maslow kind of had a good model where you have to fulfill those kind of lower things first. And it's true that we need to understand what God has done for us before we can really say in truth that we have heard and believed and repented and done all those other things, is that we need to have that solid foundation first. So if you're sitting in the audience and you feel like that's lacking, that's thankfully something that we can work on. We can um, start a private Bible study with you. We can start a new class that kind of focuses more on those things and doesn't necessarily stick to just one book, but it can go over any questions that you have about God's part and what He's done and understanding how that's been made freely available to you. That's something that we can do, and that's something that you don't have to necessarily come up during the invitation song. You can talk to somebody privately here when we kind of meet and visit afterwards, or you can send a text message to somebody whose number you have. That's a very, very important thing that we need to work on together as Christians. But then going into man's part, um, there's few steps there, and there's Bible verses attached there, and I encourage you to start there and read those things. And if those still aren't making sense to you, and I don't really expect that two verses are going to make a huge difference in making you realize that you have to take the step there, but that's again another thing that we can study together. And as Christians, I feel like um, that stage of repentance and confessing are things that we again we fluctuate between all the time, that we have to continually keep track of. And being Christian is not an easy thing. it's it's challenging, and that's why people fall away, is because it's not always easy to always be moving upward in that sense. And so if you need help with one of those things, if you feel like you're stuck in that kind of category, then that's something that we can pray for you. We can encourage one another, and we can study again more about how we can better be Christians together. And then, kind of finally, if you have the desire in your heart to be baptized and to begin that journey as a Christian, that's something else that we can certainly help you with today. And that is something where I encourage you to come forward during the song of invitation that we'll sing after the lesson, um, or just make it known today, and ideally before you leave this building, because as we read in James chapter 4, verse 14, we do not know what the future holds, and our life on earth is just a mist. Unfortunately, something could happen as soon as you leave this building, and it's not in our control. And again, if you haven't addressed your survival in eternity and you haven't addressed what will happen to you after you pass from this earth, that's something that, it's not fun to think about, but it's crucial and it's vital and it's absolutely necessary to think about that, because God has prepared a great home and a great gift for us in heaven, and something that we can look forward to and have all of our cares and all of our needs in eternity taken care of. And what a beautiful thing that is. And He's paid through Christ's sacrifice the ultimate price for us to be able to secure that future. And so, if you have any needs, and again, if you need to be baptized, I encourage you to come forward today and just allow us to pray with you and encourage you and help each other through our journey as Christians and our steps up this pyramid together. So, again, if you have any needs, please come forward as we stand and sing Song of Invitation.